The security guard at Fort McKenzie's main gate barely looked up from his clipboard when Sarah Chen approached the checkpoint. Her civilian clothes and quiet demeanor marked her as just another contractor or family member seeking base access. What he couldn't see beneath her long-sleeve jacket was the intricate purple heart tattoo that wrapped around her left forearm, a symbol that would change everything once revealed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen had been trying to gain access to Fort McKenzie for 3 weeks, and each attempt ended the same way. Despite her valid credentials as a civilian military consultant, despite her specialized training documentation, despite her legitimate appointment with the base's Tactical Operations Center, she was consistently turned away at the security checkpoint. The issue wasn't her paperwork. The issue was perception. At 32 years old, Sarah possessed an unassuming presence that seemed to make her invisible in rooms full of military personnel. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slight build and wire-rimmed glasses, she looked more like a librarian than someone with extensive combat experience. Her quiet voice and polite manner only reinforced the impression that she was somehow out of place in a military environment. Major Robert Sterling, the base's deputy commander, had made his position clear during their phone conversation the previous week. The Fort McKenzie training facility was reserved for active duty personnel and approved military contractors with demonstrated field experience. Sarah's credentials, while technically valid, didn't meet his personal standards for base access. What Major Sterling didn't know was that Sarah Chen had spent 4 years as a combat medic in Afghanistan, serving 3 tours in some of the most dangerous regions of Helmand Province. She'd saved 17 lives under direct enemy fire, been wounded twice in IED attacks, and received commendations for valor that she'd never mentioned to anyone at Fort McKenzie. The purple heart tattoo hidden beneath her jacket sleeve told a story she'd never shared with the bureaucrats who kept denying her access. The intricate design incorporated elements from her service record that only another veteran would recognize. The dates, coordinates, and symbols woven into the artwork represented moments when she'd crawled through gunfire to reach wounded soldiers, when she'd performed emergency surgery in foxholes, when she'd made decisions that meant the difference between life and death for her teammates. But Sarah had learned long ago that military culture often judged people by appearance rather than accomplishment. Her Asian heritage, small stature, and soft-spoken manner seemed to convince people that she couldn't possibly have the background her credentials claimed. Rather than fight those perceptions directly, she'd developed a strategy of letting her work speak for itself. The problem was getting the opportunity to work at all. Dr. Amanda Foster, the base's chief medical officer, had specifically requested Sarah's consultation on a new trauma training protocol. Foster had read about Sarah's innovative field medicine techniques in several medical journals and wanted her expertise for developing advanced battlefield medical training. The consultation was scheduled to begin 3 weeks ago, but Major Sterling's gatekeeping had prevented it from happening. Sarah's approach to the security checkpoint on this particular Monday morning followed her usual routine. She presented her identification, consultant credentials, and appointment documentation to Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, the morning shift supervisor. Rodriguez had processed her paperwork multiple times over the past 3 weeks, and his expression showed both sympathy and frustration with the situation. "Ms. Chen, your paperwork is still in order," Rodriguez said apologetically. "But Major Sterling left specific instructions that your access request needs additional verification before approval." Sarah had heard this explanation before. Additional verification was military bureaucracy's way of saying no, without actually saying no. It meant her credentials would be reviewed indefinitely, while she remained excluded from the base. "Sergeant Rodriguez, could you help me understand what additional verification means in this context?" Sarah asked politely. "Dr. Foster's expecting me for a consultation that's already been delayed 3 weeks." Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. He'd been in the military long enough to recognize when politics were interfering with operations, but he also understood the consequences of challenging a major's direct orders. Sarah's obvious qualifications and professional demeanor made the situation particularly frustrating for him. "Ma'am, I wish I could give you a better answer. Major Sterling's office handles all contractor approvals, and they haven't cleared your access yet." Through the checkpoint window, Sarah could see Fort McKenzie's main facilities. The medical training center where she was supposed to be working was visible in the distance. a modern building designed specifically for the kind of advanced trauma education she'd been hired to develop. 3 weeks of delays meant that soldiers who could benefit from improved medical training were missing critical instruction. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years saving lives in actual combat zones, but she couldn't get permission to teach others how to save lives in a training environment. The system designed to protect military effectiveness was actively preventing military improvement. "Is there someone else I could speak with about expediting this process?" Sarah asked. "The training program I'm here to develop could affect battlefield medical outcomes for deployed units." Rodriguez hesitated before responding. He'd overheard enough conversations to know that Major Sterling's resistance to Sarah's access wasn't based on legitimate security concerns. Sterling had made comments about civilian contractors who didn't understand military culture, about outsiders who thought they could teach soldiers how to do their jobs. The subtext was clear to anyone paying attention. "You could try calling the base commander's office directly," Rodriguez suggested quietly. "Colonel Patricia Hayes might be able to clarify the situation." Sarah thanked him and returned to her rental car in the visitor parking area. She'd been staying at a motel 15 miles from the base, extending her original 3-day consultation into a 3-week ordeal that was straining both her finances and her patience. The contract with Fort McKenzie represented months of income, but more importantly, it represented the opportunity to translate her combat experience into training that could save lives. The phone call to Colonel Hayes' office connected her with Captain Lisa Park, the colonel's executive assistant. Park listened to Sarah's explanation with professional courtesy, but her response was predictably bureaucratic. "Miss Chen, I understand your frustration with the access process. However, Major Sterling is responsible for contractor security clearances, and we can't override his assessment without cause. Captain Park, could you help me understand what would constitute cause in this situation? My credentials have been verified multiple times, and Dr. Foster has been waiting 3 weeks for this consultation to begin." Park paused before responding, and Sarah sensed there was more to the situation than standard bureaucratic delays. "Ms. Chen, I'll speak with Colonel Hayes about your situation. However, I should mention that there have been concerns about outside consultants who might not understand our operational environment." The phrase operational environment was military code for culture and hierarchy. Sarah had heard similar language during her years of active service, usually from officers who believed that outsiders couldn't possibly understand military life. The irony was particularly bitter given her own service record. "I appreciate your time, Captain Park. I'll continue waiting for approval." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car looking at Fort McKenzie's imposing gates. The base represented everything she'd fought to protect during her deployments, but now she was being excluded from contributing to its mission. The disconnect between her actual qualifications and the perceptions that kept her locked out was becoming increasingly difficult to tolerate. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Foster. "Any update on access approval? Training schedule is backing up without your input." Sarah stared at the message for several minutes before responding. "Still working on it. We'll update soon." She couldn't bring herself to explain that she was being excluded based on assumptions about her background and capabilities. Foster had hired her based on published research and professional recommendations, not on personal meetings or appearances. The contrast between Foster's confidence in her abilities and Sterling's dismissive attitude was stark. As Sarah prepared to drive back to her motel, she noticed a commotion at the base's main gate. Several vehicles with emergency lights were approaching from inside the base, and security personnel were moving with obvious urgency. Something significant was happening at Fort McKenzie. Through her car window, she could hear radio chatter from the security checkpoint. Emergency medical training exercise had gone wrong. Multiple casualties requiring immediate advanced trauma care. All available medical personnel were being called to respond. Sarah's instincts from 4 years of combat medicine immediately kicked in. Her hands moved automatically to check her medical bag, a habit she'd maintained since leaving active duty. The bag contained basic trauma supplies she carried everywhere, tools that had saved lives in Afghanistan and could potentially help now. But she wasn't allowed on the base. She watched emergency vehicles race past the checkpoint while she sat in the parking lot, a trained combat medic prevented from helping because of bureaucratic gatekeeping. The situation felt like a metaphor for everything wrong with military hierarchy that prioritized perception over capability. Major Sterling's voice was audible over the security radios, coordinating the emergency response with the confidence of someone who'd never actually treated trauma patients under pressure. He was calling for additional medical support while a qualified trauma specialist sat 50 feet away, denied access to help. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She got out of her car and walked purposefully toward the security checkpoint, where Sergeant Rodriguez was monitoring the emergency communications. Her approach was calm but determined, the bearing of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions in much worse circumstances. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm a combat medic with 4 years of trauma experience. If they need medical support, I can help." Rodriguez looked at her with surprise and recognition. He'd processed her credentials enough times to know her background, but he'd never connected her quiet civilian appearance with actual combat experience. The urgency in his radio earpiece was escalating as the situation at the medical training center deteriorated. "Ma'am, I can't authorize your access without Major Sterling's approval. Then get Major Sterling on the radio and tell him a qualified trauma medic is available to assist." Rodriguez hesitated for a moment before keying his radio. "Base command. This is Main Gate Security. We have a civilian medical consultant requesting permission to assist with the emergency." Sterling's response crackled through the radio with obvious irritation. "Negative. We don't need civilian interference with military medical operations." Sarah listened to the exchange with growing frustration. Emergency voices in the background of Sterling's transmission indicated that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. People were in danger while she was being excluded based on assumptions about her qualifications. "Sergeant, please tell Major Sterling that the civilian consultant is Sarah Chen, a former combat medic with extensive trauma experience." Rodriguez relayed the message, but Sterling's response remained unchanged. "Negative. Civilian personnel are not authorized for emergency response operations." Through the checkpoint window, Sarah could see additional emergency vehicles racing toward the medical training center. The radio chatter suggested multiple casualties requiring immediate advanced care. Her medical training was screaming at her to find a way to help, but military bureaucracy was creating an impossible barrier. That's when Sarah made the decision that would reveal everything she'd been hiding. She pulled up the sleeve of her jacket, exposing the purple heart tattoo that wrapped around her left forearm. The intricate design immediately caught Sergeant Rodriguez's attention, and his expression changed from sympathetic confusion to shocked recognition. The tattoo wasn't just decorative artwork. It was a detailed memorial that incorporated specific elements only a veteran would understand. Coordinates from Helmand Province, dates from her deployment, symbols representing Medical Corps service. Most prominently, the outline of a Purple Heart medal, surrounded by the names of 17 soldiers whose lives she'd saved under fire. Rodriguez stared at the tattoo for several seconds before looking back at Sarah's face with completely new understanding. The quiet civilian consultant he'd been turning away for 3 weeks was actually a decorated combat veteran, with more field experience than most of the medical personnel currently responding to the emergency. "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez whispered. "You're military." "Former military," Sarah corrected. "But still a medic when people need help." Rodriguez looked at his radio, then at the emergency vehicles still racing past the checkpoint, then back at Sarah's tattoo. The decision he was about to make would either save lives or end his career, but the choice was obvious to anyone who understood what the Purple Heart tattoo represented. "Ma'am, I'm opening the gate. Get to the medical training center and help whoever needs it." Sarah was already moving before he finished speaking. She grabbed her medical bag from her car and ran through the security checkpoint, with the purposeful stride of someone who'd crossed much more dangerous ground to reach wounded soldiers. Behind her, Rodriguez was already calling the medical training center to announce that additional qualified medical support was en route. As Sarah ran toward the emergency, she felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried her through countless medical crises in Afghanistan. The hesitation and uncertainty of the past 3 weeks disappeared, replaced by the focused clarity that had made her one of the most effective combat medics in her unit. The Purple Heart tattoo on her arm caught the morning sunlight as she ran, each element of its design representing moments when she'd proven herself under the worst possible circumstances. Today, she would prove herself again. Major Sterling was about to learn that his assumptions about the quiet civilian consultant had been catastrophically wrong. The base emergency was about to reveal exactly who Sarah Chen really was, and why Dr. Foster had specifically requested her expertise. The woman who'd been banned from Fort McKenzie for 3 weeks was finally getting the chance to show what she could do when military bureaucracy stopped standing in her way. The results would transform not just the emergency response, but the entire base's understanding of what real capability looked like when it came disguised as humility and professionalism. Fort McKenzie's Medical Training Center had never seen anything like what was about to happen when a true combat veteran finally got the opportunity to demonstrate why appearances meant nothing compared to actual experience under fire. The emergency that had seemed manageable to Major Sterling was about to become a masterclass in trauma medicine, delivered by someone who'd learned her skills in the crucible of actual combat. Sarah Chen's exclusion from the base was about to end in the most dramatic way possible, proving that sometimes the most qualified person in the room was the one everyone had overlooked. As she approached the medical training center, Sarah could hear the chaos inside. Shouted medical terminology, equipment alarms, and the kind of organized panic that happened when training scenarios went beyond their intended parameters. She'd heard those sounds before in field hospitals across Afghanistan, and she knew exactly how to bring order to medical chaos. The door to the medical training center was propped open as emergency personnel rushed in and out. Sarah paused for a moment at the threshold, her medical bag in one hand and years of combat experience ready to be unleashed. Through the doorway, she could see multiple casualties from what appeared to be a training accident involving explosive charges and realistic wound simulation that had gone too far. Major Sterling was visible across the room, coordinating response efforts with obvious stress. He hadn't noticed her arrival yet, but when he did, everything would change. The civilian consultant he'd been dismissing for 3 weeks was about to demonstrate exactly why Dr. Foster had specifically requested her expertise. Sarah Chen stepped through the doorway and into the emergency with the quiet confidence of someone who'd done this work under much worse conditions. The purple heart tattoo on her exposed forearm caught the fluorescent lighting, and several medical personnel noticed the detailed military artwork with surprise and growing recognition. The woman who'd been banned from Fort McKenzie was finally inside, and she was about to prove that combat experience couldn't be replicated in training exercises or academic settings. Real trauma medicine required the kind of skills that could only be learned under fire, and Sarah had learned those skills saving actual lives in actual combat zones. The emergency response was about to get significantly more effective, and Major Sterling's gatekeeping was about to be exposed as the dangerous bureaucratic failure it had always been. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought against external enemies, but against internal systems that prevented qualified people from doing their jobs. Fort McKenzie's Medical Training Center was about to witness what happened when real combat experience finally got the chance to demonstrate its value without bureaucratic interference. The results would change not just the immediate emergency, but the entire base's approach to recognizing and utilizing actual expertise, regardless of how it was packaged. The Medical Training Center's main hall erupted in controlled chaos as Sarah stepped through the entrance. What she saw made her combat-trained instincts immediately categorize the situation as a mass casualty event that had spiraled beyond the facility's normal capabilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 6 training mannequins lay scattered across the floor, but these weren't the standard plastic dummies used for routine medical exercises. These were sophisticated simulators capable of bleeding, breathing, and mimicking real physiological responses to trauma. The problem was that the training scenario had gone catastrophically wrong. An explosive charge, designed to simulate battlefield conditions, had detonated with more force than intended, sending shrapnel through the training area and causing actual injuries to the medical students who'd been practicing on the simulators. Real blood mixed with synthetic fluids across the polished floor, and the distinction between training casualties and actual casualties had become dangerously blurred. Dr. Amanda Foster knelt beside a young corpsman whose leg was pinned beneath a piece of twisted metal that had been launched by the explosion. The corpsman was conscious but losing blood at a rate that demanded immediate intervention. Foster's hands moved competently as she attempted to control the bleeding, but her laboratory background hadn't prepared her for the kind of field trauma medicine this situation required. 3 other medical students showed various degrees of injury from flying debris. One had taken shrapnel to the shoulder and was being treated by a nursing instructor whose textbook knowledge was struggling to meet the reality of traumatic blood loss. Another student sat against the wall holding a compress against a head wound that was bleeding more heavily than standard first aid protocols could manage. The most serious case lay unconscious near the center of the room. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, the training center's primary medical instructor, had been closest to the explosion when it occurred. She'd taken multiple fragments to her torso and appeared to be going into shock despite the efforts of two corpsmen who were applying pressure dressings with obvious uncertainty about their next steps. Major Sterling stood near the doorway coordinating radio communications with base medical personnel, but his coordination efforts were hampered by his lack of actual trauma experience. He was calling for ambulances and emergency room teams while the people in front of him needed immediate field stabilization to survive the transport to proper medical facilities. Sarah assessed the entire scene in the 10 seconds it took her to cross from the doorway to the nearest casualty. Her combat experience automatically prioritized the injuries by severity and survival probability, identifying which patients needed immediate intervention and which could wait. The unconscious instructor was bleeding internally and needed surgical intervention that couldn't wait for ambulance transport. The corpsman with the leg injury required immediate vascular repair to prevent permanent damage. The other casualties needed proper wound cleaning and suturing but weren't in immediate danger. Dr. Foster looked up as Sarah approached, recognizing her from photographs, but clearly surprised to see her inside the restricted facility. "Sarah, how did you get base access? We've been trying to get approval for your consultation for weeks." "Emergency authorization," Sarah replied, already kneeling beside Staff Sergeant Gonzalez and examining her injuries with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Foster, this patient needs immediate surgical intervention for internal bleeding. Do you have a surgical suite in this facility?" Foster shook her head. "This is a training center. Our surgical capabilities are limited to basic procedures. The main hospital is 20 minutes away by ambulance." Sarah's hands were already working as she spoke. Her medical bag opened beside her as she pulled out trauma supplies that most civilian medical consultants wouldn't carry. Her equipment was field-tested gear designed for combat conditions, tools that had saved lives in situations much worse than this training center accident. "She won't survive 20 minutes of transport without stabilization," Sarah said, inserting an IV with the kind of speed and precision that came from performing the procedure under enemy fire. "I need to control this bleeding here before we can move her safely." Major Sterling's voice carried across the room as he coordinated with emergency services, but his tone shifted when he noticed Sarah working on the casualties. "Who authorized civilian personnel to treat military medical emergencies?" he demanded, approaching with obvious agitation. Dr. Foster looked up from her own patient. "Major Sterling, this is Sarah Chen, the medical consultant I've been requesting for 3 weeks. She's trying to save Sergeant Gonzalez's life." "I don't care who she is," Sterling replied. "Civilian contractors are not authorized to provide medical treatment to military personnel." "Miss Chen, step away from that patient immediately." Sarah didn't look up from her work as she responded. Her hands continued their precise movements, establishing vascular access and beginning fluid resuscitation with the kind of confidence that came from years of practice under pressure. "Major Sterling, this patient is going into hypovolemic shock from internal bleeding. If I step away now, she dies." "That's not your decision to make. Military medical personnel will handle this situation." "Which military medical personnel?" Sarah asked, finally looking up at Sterling with eyes that had seen much worse situations than this. "Dr. Foster is a research physician, not a trauma surgeon. Your corpsmen are trained in basic first aid, not advanced trauma life support. Sergeant Gonzalez needs someone with combat medical experience, and I'm the only person in this room who has it." Sterling's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. The challenge to his authority was being delivered in front of his subordinates by someone he'd spent 3 weeks excluding from the base. "Miss Chen, you are not qualified to make medical decisions for military personnel regardless of whatever credentials you claim to have." The word claim hung in the air like a physical insult. Sarah had been hearing variations of that dismissal for 3 weeks, but hearing it while she was trying to save someone's life pushed her past the point of polite accommodation. She stood up from beside her patient, her hands still maintaining pressure on critical pressure points, and looked directly at Major Sterling. "I don't claim to have medical credentials, Major. I have them. 4 years as a combat medic in Afghanistan, 3 deployments in Helmand Province, 17 lives saved under direct enemy fire. I've treated more actual trauma in real combat conditions than everyone else in this room combined." Dr. Foster stared at Sarah with sudden understanding. The quiet consultant she'd been trying to bring to the base for 3 weeks was actually a combat veteran, with exactly the kind of experience the training center desperately needed. Foster's own research had focused on battlefield medicine, but she'd never actually practiced it under real conditions. One of the wounded corpsmen who'd been watching Sarah work looked at Major Sterling with obvious confusion. "Sir, she knows what she's doing. My bleeding stopped completely after she applied that pressure dressing." Sterling's authority was being undermined by results that he couldn't argue with, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down from his position. "I don't care what her background is. Military protocol requires proper authorization for civilian medical intervention." "Military protocol," Sarah said quietly, "requires medical personnel to save lives when they have the training and opportunity to do so. Right now, I'm the most qualified person in this room to treat combat-style trauma injuries, and these patients need immediate care that can't wait for bureaucratic authorization." She turned back to Sergeant Gonzalez, whose condition was stabilizing under Sarah's treatment but remained critical. "Dr. Foster, I need you to maintain this IV line while I examine her abdominal injuries. The internal bleeding appears to be from a splenic laceration that I can potentially repair if we act quickly." Foster immediately moved to assist, recognizing that Sarah's experience was exactly what the situation required. "What do you need me to do?" "Monitor her blood pressure and pulse rate while I prep for emergency surgery. If her pressure drops below 90 systolic, we'll need to increase the fluid replacement rate." Major Sterling watched the coordination between Sarah and Dr. Foster with growing frustration. His attempts to maintain control over the situation were being ignored by medical personnel who recognized expertise when they saw it. The wounded patients were responding positively to Sarah's treatment, making his objections appear increasingly unreasonable. "This is completely inappropriate," Sterling announced to the room. "I'm calling base security to remove unauthorized personnel from this emergency scene." "You do that," Sarah replied without looking up from her surgical preparation. "But explain to them that you're removing the only person in this facility qualified to perform emergency trauma surgery on a patient who will die without immediate intervention." Dr. Foster looked between Sarah and Major Sterling with obvious conflict. Her professional obligation was to save lives using the best available resources, but her military position required following command structure even when it conflicted with medical judgment. "Major Sterling, Sarah's credentials are legitimate. I verified her background before requesting her consultation." "Her consultation was for training development, not emergency medical treatment," Sterling replied. "There's a significant difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application in military medical situations." Sarah's hands paused in their surgical preparation, and she looked at Major Sterling with an expression that made several people in the room step backward. The quiet politeness that had characterized her demeanor for 3 weeks was gone, replaced by something much harder and more dangerous. "Theoretical knowledge?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "Major Sterling, would you like to see some practical application?" She pulled up her left sleeve completely, revealing the full scope of the purple heart tattoo that wrapped around her forearm. The detailed artwork became visible in its entirety, showing elements that made Dr. Foster gasp with recognition and understanding. The tattoo wasn't just military memorabilia. It was a comprehensive memorial that documented specific combat medical actions in precise detail. Coordinates from firefights where she treated casualties under direct enemy fire. Dates from operations where she'd performed emergency surgery in forward operating bases. Symbols representing different types of trauma she'd successfully treated in conditions much worse than this training center. Most prominently, 17 names were incorporated into the design, each representing a soldier whose life she'd saved through advanced trauma medicine performed in active combat zones. The artistic skill of the tattoo was extraordinary, but its content was what made everyone in the room understand exactly who they were dealing with. "These aren't theoretical patients," Sarah said, pointing to the names on her arm. "These are real soldiers who survived traumatic injuries because I had the training and experience to treat them under fire. Every technique I'm using on Sergeant Gonzalez I've used before to save lives in much worse conditions." Dr. Foster stared at the tattoo with professional awe. She'd read case studies of advanced battlefield medicine, but she'd never met someone who'd actually performed those procedures under combat conditions. Sarah, this represents more trauma experience than our entire training program. One of the wounded corpsmen who'd been listening to the exchange spoke up from his position against the wall. "Ma'am, that's a Purple Heart incorporated into the design." "You were wounded in action?" Sarah nodded without elaborating, her attention returning to Sergeant Gonzalez's surgery. "Twice. IED attacks. I understand trauma medicine from both the provider and patient perspectives." Major Sterling found himself in an impossible position. The woman he'd been excluding from the base for 3 weeks was demonstrating medical expertise that exceeded everyone else in the facility, and her credentials were literally written on her skin in a way that couldn't be fabricated or exaggerated. The Purple Heart tattoo represented sacrifices and accomplishments that commanded respect from anyone who understood military service. But admitting that he'd been wrong about Sarah's qualifications would require acknowledging that his gatekeeping had been based on assumptions rather than actual assessment of her capabilities. His pride and authority were now directly conflicting with the obvious evidence that she was exactly what the training center needed. "Even if your military background is legitimate," Sterling said, "civilian contractors still require proper authorization before treating military personnel. Protocol exists for important reasons." "Protocol exists to protect people," Sarah replied, "not to prevent qualified medical personnel from saving lives. Right now, protocol is getting in the way of patient care." She looked around the room at the other casualties, all of whom were stabilizing under treatment that incorporated techniques she'd learned in combat zones. "Dr. Foster, your corpsmen are doing excellent work with the guidance I've provided. These patients are ready for transport to proper surgical facilities." Foster nodded, recognizing that Sarah had managed to stabilize all the casualties in the time it had taken the emergency services to coordinate their response. "The ambulances should be here within minutes." "What about Sergeant Gonzalez?" Sarah checked her patient's vital signs, noting significant improvement in blood pressure and pulse rate. "The splenic repair is holding, and her bleeding is controlled. She'll need formal surgery to complete the procedure, but she's stable for transport now." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching ambulances became audible through the training center's open doors. The emergency medical technicians who entered the facility found a completely organized scene with all casualties properly triaged, stabilized, and ready for immediate transport to definitive care. The lead EMT, a veteran with obvious experience in emergency medicine, surveyed the scene with professional appreciation. "Whoever handled the initial trauma care did outstanding work. These patients are in much better condition than the initial reports suggested." Dr. Foster gestured towards Sarah. Sarah Chen provided the emergency trauma care. She's a former combat medic with extensive experience. The EMT looked at Sarah with new respect, noting the medical equipment she'd used and the quality of the trauma care she'd provided. "Ma'am, this is textbook emergency medicine. Where did you train?" "Afghanistan," Sarah replied simply. "Helmand Province. 3 deployments." The EMT's expression shifted to something approaching reverence. Combat medics who'd served in Afghanistan had a legendary reputation among emergency medical personnel for their ability to save lives under impossible conditions. "Ma'am, it's an honor to take over care for your patients." As the casualties were loaded onto stretchers and prepared for transport, Major Sterling found himself increasingly isolated in his opposition to Sarah's presence. Everyone else in the room had witnessed her expertise firsthand, and her results spoke louder than any credentials or authorization could. Dr. Foster approached Sarah as the last ambulance prepared to leave. "Sarah, what you accomplished here today was extraordinary. You saved lives that would have been lost without your intervention." "I did what any qualified medic would do in the same situation," Sarah replied, beginning to pack her medical equipment. "The important thing is that everyone is going to recover fully, including Sergeant Gonzalez. The splenic repair should hold until she gets to proper surgery. She'll be back to full duty within 6 weeks if there are no complications." Major Sterling overheard the conversation and realized that his attempts to exclude Sarah from the base had potentially cost lives. If the training accident had occurred without her unauthorized presence, the casualties would have been much more severe. His bureaucratic gatekeeping had created a situation where emergency medical care depended on someone breaking his direct orders. The implications for his command authority were significant, but the implications for patient care were much more important. Sterling was beginning to understand that his assumptions about Sarah's qualifications had been completely wrong, and that his resistance to her base access had been based on prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns. As the medical training center returned to a semblance of normalcy, Sarah found herself surrounded by military medical personnel who wanted to understand her techniques and learn from her experience. The quiet consultant who'd been dismissed for 3 weeks had suddenly become the most respected person in the facility, but Major Sterling still had a choice to make about how to handle the situation. Sarah had violated his direct orders by entering the base without authorization, even though her unauthorized presence had saved lives. Military discipline required consequences for disobeying orders, but military effectiveness required recognizing and utilizing exceptional capabilities. The conflict between bureaucratic authority and practical results was about to determine not just Sarah's future at Fort McKenzie, but the base's entire approach to recognizing expertise, regardless of how it was packaged or presented. Dr. Foster was already planning to recommend Sarah for permanent consulting status based on her demonstrated capabilities, but Major Sterling's opposition could still prevent that recommendation from being implemented. The battle between perception and reality was far from over, even though Sarah had proven her worth under the most challenging circumstances possible. The Purple Heart tattoo on her arm had revealed the truth about her background, but changing institutional attitudes would require more than just demonstrating medical expertise. It would require confronting the assumptions and prejudices that had created the exclusion in the first place. Fort McKenzie's approach to evaluating consultants and contractors was about to face a reckoning that would determine whether the base prioritized actual qualifications or bureaucratic comfort zones. Sarah Chen had proven herself beyond any reasonable doubt, but reasonable doubt wasn't always what drove military decision-making. The emergency was over, but the real test of Fort McKenzie's institutional wisdom was just beginning. Colonel Patricia Hayes arrived at the medical training center 30 minutes after the last ambulance departed, her expression reflecting both concern for the casualties and anger at the circumstances that had led to the emergency. As Fort McKenzie's commanding officer, she'd been in a crucial budget meeting when the initial reports came through, but the severity of the situation had demanded her immediate attention. What she found upon arrival was a facility that had been completely transformed by crisis and recovery. The training area had been cleaned and reorganized with military efficiency, but the emotional atmosphere still carried traces of the life-and-death drama that had unfolded. Dr. Foster was completing incident reports, while several corpsmen discussed trauma techniques they'd witnessed during the emergency response. Major Sterling stood near the center of the room, his posture reflecting the uncomfortable position he'd found himself in after spending 3 weeks excluding the person who'd ultimately saved lives during the crisis. His attempts to maintain authority over the situation had been systematically undermined by results he couldn't argue with, and his opposition to Sarah's presence now appeared both petty and dangerous. Sarah herself sat quietly in a corner of the facility, completing her own documentation of the medical procedures she'd performed. Her medical bag was packed and ready, suggesting she expected to be escorted off the base once Colonel Hayes reviewed the situation. The Purple Heart tattoo on her exposed forearm remained visible, its detailed artwork catching the fluorescent lighting in ways that made its military significance unmistakable to anyone who understood combat decorations. Colonel Hayes surveyed the scene with the analytical mind of someone who'd commanded military installations for over 20 years. She'd seen enough emergency situations to recognize when response efforts had been exceptional, and the feedback she'd received from the emergency medical team suggested that initial trauma care had exceeded their expectations significantly. "Dr. Foster," Hayes began, "I need a complete briefing on what happened here and how the casualties were managed before emergency services arrived." Foster looked up from her paperwork with obvious respect for her commanding officer, but also with excitement about the medical response she'd witnessed. "Colonel Hayes, the training exercise explosion created 6 casualties requiring immediate advanced trauma care. The situation exceeded our facility's normal capabilities, but we had extraordinary medical support that prevented any fatalities." "What kind of medical support?" Foster gestured toward Sarah, who remained focused on her documentation. "Sarah Chen, the civilian medical consultant I've been requesting access for. She provided emergency trauma care that stabilized all casualties before ambulance transport." Hayes studied Sarah with increased interest, noting the contrast between her civilian appearance and the military-grade medical equipment visible in her bag. Ms. Chen, I understand you gained base access during the emergency despite previous authorization difficulties. Sarah looked up from her paperwork, meeting the colonel's gaze with calm professionalism. Yes, Colonel Hayes. Sergeant Rodriguez authorized emergency access when medical support was needed for the casualties. Sergeant Rodriguez doesn't have authority to override Major Sterling's access restrictions, Hayes replied carefully. However, I'm more interested in understanding your qualifications for providing advanced trauma care to military personnel. Before Sarah could respond, Major Sterling interjected with obvious frustration. Colonel Hayes, Ms. Chen, violated direct orders by entering this facility without proper authorization. Regardless of the outcome, military discipline requires consequences for insubordination. Hayes held up a hand to silence Sterling, while maintaining her focus on Sarah. Ms. Chen, please explain your medical background and how you were qualified to treat these casualties. Sarah set down her pen and looked directly at Colonel Hayes, her demeanor shifting subtly from civilian consultant to military professional reporting to a superior officer. Colonel Hayes, I served 4 years as a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, primarily in Helmand Province. I treated 17 casualties under direct enemy fire and was wounded twice in IED attacks. She extended her left arm to display the Purple Heart tattoo more clearly. This represents my service record and the soldiers whose lives I saved through advanced battlefield medicine. Hayes examined the tattoo with growing recognition and respect. As a career military officer, she understood the significance of Purple Heart decorations and the level of sacrifice they represented. The detailed artwork on Sarah's arm told a story of combat service that commanded respect from anyone who'd worn the uniform. You received the Purple Heart twice? Hayes asked. Yes, Colonel. Once for shrapnel wounds sustained while treating casualties during a mortar attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman. The second time for injuries from an IED explosion while evacuating wounded soldiers from an ambush site. Dr. Foster watched the exchange with fascination as Sarah's complete military background emerged. The quiet consultant she'd been trying to hire for 3 weeks was revealing a service record that exceeded most of the medical personnel currently stationed at Fort McKenzie. Colonel Hayes continued her questioning with the thoroughness of someone evaluating critical information. What was your primary medical training before deployment? Advanced combat medical training at Fort Sam Houston, followed by specialized trauma surgery instruction at Brooke Army Medical Center. I completed additional training in battlefield medicine at the Special Operations Medical Training course. The credentials Sarah was describing represented the highest level of military medical training available, education that prepared medics for the most dangerous and challenging medical situations possible. Hayes recognized that such training couldn't be fabricated or exaggerated, especially when combined with actual combat experience. Ms. Chen, why didn't you mention your military background when you applied for consultant access to this facility? Sarah's expression reflected the frustration she'd been carrying for 3 weeks. Colonel Hayes, I included my complete service record in my initial application materials. My DD-214, medical training certificates, and combat deployment documentation were all submitted with my consulting contract. Hayes turned toward Major Sterling with obvious confusion. Major Sterling, you reviewed Ms. Chen's complete application file before denying base access? Sterling's discomfort became increasingly visible as the scope of his oversight became apparent. Colonel Hayes, I reviewed the essential elements of her application. Her civilian consultant status was the primary factor in my assessment. Did you review her military service record? I noted that she had prior military experience, but civilian contractor protocols focus on current qualifications rather than historical background. Hayes stared at Sterling with the kind of cold anger that made junior officers reconsider their career choices. Major Sterling, you denied base access to a decorated combat veteran with advanced medical training because you didn't consider her military service relevant to a military medical consulting position. The question hung in the air like an indictment. Sterling had been caught making decisions based on assumptions rather than facts, and his gatekeeping had potentially endangered lives by excluding someone with exactly the qualifications the base needed. Dr. Foster seized the opportunity to support Sarah's position with concrete evidence. Colonel Hayes, Sarah's emergency response today was extraordinary. She performed advanced trauma surgery that saved Sergeant Gonzalez's life, stabilized multiple casualties, and coordinated care that exceeded anything our training center could have provided independently. What specifically did she accomplish? Emergency splenic repair on a patient going into shock from internal bleeding, vascular reconstruction on a traumatic leg injury, advanced wound management on multiple shrapnel casualties, all performed under pressure with equipment from her personal medical kit. Hayes looked back at Sarah with increased respect. You carry surgical equipment as a civilian consultant? Old habits from combat deployment, Sarah replied. I've maintained my trauma certification and equipment readiness since leaving active duty. Medical emergencies don't wait for proper authorization. The implicit criticism of Sterling's bureaucratic delays wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Sarah had been prepared to provide exactly the kind of medical support the base needed, but administrative gatekeeping had prevented her from contributing until lives were at stake. Colonel Hayes made a decision that would reshape Fort McKenzie's approach to recognizing expertise. Ms. Chen, I'm granting you immediate permanent base access with full consulting privileges. Your contract with Dr. Foster is approved retroactively to your original start date 3 weeks ago. Sterling's face reflected shock and professional embarrassment. Colonel Hayes, Ms. Chen, still violated direct orders by entering the facility without authorization. Major Sterling, Ms. Chen saved lives that would have been lost due to your administrative failures. Any disciplinary action will be directed toward the person whose poor judgment created the dangerous situation. The threat was unmistakable. Sterling's resistance to Sarah's qualification had been exposed as both unreasonable and dangerous, and his authority was being publicly undermined by his commanding officer. His career at Fort McKenzie was effectively over. Hayes continued her address to the room. Dr. Foster, I want a complete review of our medical training protocols with Ms. Chen's input. If we have access to combat-proven medical expertise, we should be incorporating it into our standard curriculum. Foster nodded enthusiastically. Colonel Hayes, I'd like to propose expanding Sarah's consulting role to include development of advanced battlefield medicine training for all base medical personnel. Approved. Ms. Chen, are you interested in a more comprehensive consulting arrangement? Sarah considered the offer carefully. 3 weeks of bureaucratic exclusion had been replaced by recognition and opportunity that exceeded her original consulting contract. Colonel Hayes, I'd be honored to contribute to military medical training in whatever capacity would be most beneficial. Excellent. Major Sterling, you're relieved of oversight responsibilities for civilian contractor approvals. All future consulting arrangements will be coordinated directly through my office. Sterling's demotion was swift and decisive, eliminating his ability to interfere with qualified personnel based on personal biases or administrative convenience. His gatekeeping authority had been stripped away by the consequences of his own poor judgment. Dr. Foster approached Sarah with obvious excitement about their expanded collaboration. Sarah, I have dozens of questions about the trauma techniques you used today. Would you be available to brief our medical staff on advanced battlefield procedures? I'd be happy to share whatever knowledge might be useful, Sarah replied. Combat medicine involves techniques that aren't typically taught in civilian medical training, but they can be incredibly effective for traumatic injuries. One of the corpsmen who'd been treated during the emergency approached with respectful curiosity. Ma'am, the pressure dressing technique you used stopped my bleeding immediately. Could you teach that method to our medical training classes? Sarah smiled at the young soldier's eagerness to learn. Pressure dressing under combat conditions requires understanding blood flow dynamics and wound physiology in ways that standard first aid doesn't address. I can definitely include that in the training curriculum. Colonel Hayes watched the interaction between Sarah and the medical personnel with satisfaction. The base had gained access to expertise that could improve medical readiness for deployed units, and the bureaucratic obstacles that had prevented that access had been eliminated. Ms. Chen, I understand you've been staying off base due to access restrictions. We'll arrange quarters in the visiting officer facilities immediately. Thank you, Colonel Hayes. That would eliminate the daily commute challenges I've been facing. Hayes turned toward the assembled medical personnel. I want everyone to understand that today's emergency response represents the standard we expect for all medical situations. Ms. Chen's expertise will be available for training and consultation, and I expect all medical personnel to take advantage of her knowledge. The transformation in Sarah's status was complete and dramatic. 3 weeks of exclusion had been replaced by recognition, respect, and authority that reflected her actual qualifications rather than superficial impressions. The Purple Heart tattoo that had initially been hidden was now visible as a symbol of expertise that commanded attention and respect. Dr. Foster began planning expanded training programs that would incorporate Sarah's combat experience into standard medical education for the base. Sarah, I'd like to develop a comprehensive battlefield medicine curriculum that includes both theoretical knowledge and practical application. Combat medicine is best taught through simulation exercises that replicate actual battlefield conditions, Sarah replied. We can create training scenarios that prepare medics for the psychological and technical challenges they'll face in deployment. The corpsman who'd been injured during the emergency raised his hand with a question. Ma'am, how do you stay calm during medical emergencies? Everything happened so fast, but you seemed completely in control. Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. Combat medical training teaches you to compartmentalize emotional responses while focusing on technical procedures. You learn to treat the injury rather than react to the situation. Is that something you can teach? Absolutely. Stress inoculation is a critical component of medical training that can be developed through progressive exposure to challenging scenarios. Colonel Hayes listened to the discussion with appreciation for the learning opportunity Sarah represented. Fort McKenzie's medical capabilities were about to be significantly enhanced by incorporating real combat experience into their training programs. Ms. Chen, I'll arrange for you to address our senior medical staff tomorrow morning. I want a comprehensive briefing on how we can improve our medical readiness through lessons learned from your combat experience. I'll prepare a presentation covering advanced trauma techniques, combat medical protocols, and training methodologies that have proven effective under actual battlefield conditions. Major Sterling remained in the background, his authority diminished and his position at the base uncertain. His attempts to exclude Sarah based on assumptions and bureaucratic convenience had been exposed as dangerous failures that could have cost lives. As the group began dispersing to return to normal duties, Dr. Foster approached Sarah with personal gratitude. Sarah, I want to thank you for everything you accomplished today. You saved lives and demonstrated exactly why I requested your expertise for this consultation. I'm glad I could help, Sarah replied. Medical emergencies don't respect authorization procedures or bureaucratic timelines. When people need help, qualified personnel should be available to provide it. The subtle criticism of the administrative delays wasn't lost on anyone present. Sarah's 3 weeks of exclusion had been unnecessary and potentially dangerous, preventing the base from accessing expertise that could have improved medical readiness and training effectiveness. Colonel Hayes made a final announcement before leaving the Medical Training Center. Effective immediately, Ms. Chen is appointed as Senior Medical Consultant for Combat Medicine Training. She'll have full access to all base facilities and authority to develop training programs as she deems appropriate. The appointment represented complete vindication for Sarah's qualifications and a comprehensive rejection of the bureaucratic gatekeeping that had excluded her. Her expertise was finally being recognized and utilized in ways that would benefit military medical readiness. As Sarah packed her equipment and prepared to move into base quarters, she reflected on the dramatic transformation of her situation. The Purple Heart tattoo that had been hidden beneath her sleeve for 3 weeks was now visible as a symbol of expertise and sacrifice that commanded respect throughout Fort McKenzie. The quiet civilian consultant who'd been dismissed and excluded had become the base's most valued medical training asset, proving that appearances meant nothing compared to actual qualifications and demonstrated capability under pressure. Dr. Foster began planning the expanded medical training program with excitement about incorporating Sarah's combat experience into their curriculum. Sarah, this is going to revolutionize our approach to medical readiness training. Combat medicine saves lives, Sarah replied. If we can prepare medics for the realities they'll face in deployment, we can bring more soldiers home safely. The mission that had begun as a simple consulting contract had evolved into something much larger and more important. Sarah's expertise would now influence medical training for deployed units, potentially saving lives in future combat operations. Fort McKenzie had gained more than just a qualified consultant. They'd gained a combat veteran whose experience could transform their entire approach to medical readiness and training effectiveness. Major Sterling's gatekeeping had been not just wrong, but dangerous in its exclusion of exactly the expertise the base needed most. His career would serve as a warning about the consequences of making decisions based on assumptions rather than qualifications. The woman who'd been banned from the military base had become its most valuable medical training asset, proving that true expertise couldn't be hidden forever, and that bureaucratic prejudice ultimately failed when confronted with real capability and demonstrated results. Sarah Chen's journey from excluded consultant to respected expert was complete, but her real work was just beginning. The lives she could save through improved medical training would be her lasting legacy at Fort McKenzie and beyond. The Purple Heart tattoo on her arm would remain visible as a reminder that honor, sacrifice, and expertise deserved recognition, regardless of how they were packaged or presented. Sometimes the most qualified person in the room was the one everyone had overlooked, waiting for the chance to prove their worth when it mattered most. 6 months after the Medical Training Center emergency, Fort McKenzie had transformed into one of the military's premier combat medicine training facilities. Sarah Chen's influence extended far beyond the original consulting contract that had brought her to the base, creating ripple effects that improved medical readiness across multiple military installations. The advanced combat medicine training program she'd developed was now being implemented at bases throughout the continental United States and overseas. Her innovative approach to stress inoculation training had reduced medical error rates in combat zones by 37%, while her psychological preparation techniques had improved medic performance under fire by measurable standards that impressed Pentagon analysts. Sarah stood in her new office overlooking the expanded medical training complex, reviewing applications from military medical personnel requesting admission to her advanced certification program. The quiet consultant who'd been excluded from the base was now one of the most sought-after military medical instructors in the country, with a waiting list of students that extended months into the future. Dr. Amanda Foster knocked on the office door, carrying a folder of research data that would form the basis of their next joint publication in the Journal of Military Medicine. Their collaboration had produced groundbreaking studies on combat trauma psychology and battlefield medical decision-making that were reshaping military medical education worldwide. Sarah, the latest statistics from deployed units trained in your program are extraordinary, Foster announced, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. Casualty survival rates have improved by 22% in units with medics certified through our program. Sarah examined the data with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her approach to everything since arriving at Fort McKenzie. The numbers are encouraging, but I want to understand the specific techniques that are making the biggest difference in actual combat situations. The pressure point control methods you developed seem to be the most significant factor. Medics report that your techniques for rapid bleeding control are saving lives that would have been lost using standard procedures. The techniques Foster referenced had been developed during Sarah's deployments in Afghanistan, refined through trial and error in situations where conventional medical wisdom proved inadequate for the realities of battlefield trauma. Her ability to translate that hard-won experience into teachable skills had revolutionized military medical training. Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, the base's new deputy commander who'd replaced Major Sterling after his reassignment, appeared in the doorway with obvious excitement. "Miss Chen, I have remarkable news from the Pentagon. They want to expand your program to include special operations medical training." Sarah looked up from the research data with interest. Special operations medicine represented the highest level of military medical training, involving techniques and situations that exceeded even standard combat medicine in complexity and danger. What specific aspects of special operations medicine would the program address? Advanced trauma surgery in austere environments, psychological preparation for extended isolation medical scenarios, and coordination with civilian medical systems during humanitarian operations, Kim explained. Your combat experience and training innovations make you uniquely qualified to develop this curriculum. The opportunity represented both professional recognition and the chance to influence medical training for the military's most elite units. Sarah's expertise, which had been dismissed by bureaucratic gatekeeping just months earlier, was now being sought by the highest levels of military command for the most challenging medical training programs. Dr. Foster understood the significance of the Pentagon's request. "Sarah, this would make you the primary architect of advanced military medical training across all service branches. Your influence would affect medical readiness for decades." Sarah considered the scope of responsibility that such a position would entail. Her original consulting contract had been designed to improve training at a single base, but the success of her methods had created opportunities that extended far beyond Fort McKenzie's medical facilities. Lieutenant Colonel Kim, what timeline does the Pentagon envision for developing this expanded program? They want a comprehensive curriculum proposal within 60 days, with initial implementation beginning in 6 months. The urgency reflects their recognition that your methods represent a significant advancement in military medical capability. The compressed timeline was typical of military planning that recognized critical improvements and wanted to implement them as quickly as possible. Sarah's innovations had proven themselves under actual combat conditions, making further delays in implementation potentially costly in terms of lives that could be saved. Captain Jessica Torres, one of Sarah's most successful students from the original training program, entered the office carrying a stack of evaluation reports from recent training exercises. Torres had been a skeptical participant initially, questioning whether civilian instruction could improve military medical capabilities, but her attitude had changed dramatically after experiencing Sarah's teaching methods. Ms. Chen, the evaluation reports from this week's advanced trauma simulation are exceptional, Torres announced. Student confidence levels increased by 45%, and technical proficiency scores are the highest we've recorded. Sarah reviewed the evaluation data with satisfaction. The simulation exercises she'd designed replicated the psychological pressure and technical challenges of actual combat medical situations, preparing students for realities they couldn't experience through traditional training methods. Captain Torres, what specific aspects of the simulation did students find most valuable? The chaos management techniques and the multi-casualty prioritization scenarios. Most students had never experienced the kind of pressure you create in those exercises, and they reported feeling much more prepared for actual deployment situations. The chaos management techniques Torres referenced were skills Sarah had developed during some of her most challenging medical situations in Afghanistan. Learning to maintain clinical focus while explosions occurred around medical positions, while communication systems failed, while supplies ran low and evacuation was impossible. Dr. Foster examined the evaluation reports with professional interest. Sarah, these results suggest that your simulation methods are creating learning experiences that approximate actual combat stress. That's extraordinarily difficult to achieve in training environments. Combat medicine requires decision-making under pressure that can't be replicated through textbook learning, Sarah explained. Students need to experience something close to actual combat conditions before they face the real situations. Lieutenant Colonel Kim reviewed the training data with obvious appreciation for the program's effectiveness. Ms. Chen, these results justify the Pentagon's interest in expanding your methods to special operations training. The improvement in student performance is unprecedented. Sarah's approach to medical training had been shaped by her understanding that combat medicine involved more than technical skills. The psychological preparation required to function effectively under extreme stress was equally important and much more difficult to teach through conventional methods. The psychological component of combat medicine is often overlooked in traditional training programs, Sarah continued. Students can master the technical procedures, but they struggle when those procedures must be performed while under fire or in chaotic environments. Captain Torres nodded with recognition from her own experience. Before your program, I thought I understood trauma medicine, but I'd never experienced the kind of pressure you create in training. The first time I had to perform surgery while explosions were going off around me, I understood why that preparation was so important. The explosion effects Torres referenced were part of Sarah's innovative simulation technology that created realistic combat environments without actual danger. The system used controlled pyrotechnics, sound effects, and environmental stressors that replicated battlefield conditions while maintaining safety for students. Dr. Foster was particularly interested in the psychological aspects of Sarah's training methods. Sarah, your stress inoculation techniques are producing measurable improvements in student performance under pressure. Have you considered publishing your methodology for civilian emergency medicine training? The suggestion intrigued Sarah because her combat medical experience had taught her principles that could benefit civilian trauma medicine as well. Emergency room physicians and paramedics face similar challenges in managing critical patients under time pressure and environmental stress. The fundamental principles of trauma medicine under pressure apply to civilian emergency situations as well as military combat, Sarah replied. Many of the techniques I developed could improve civilian medical response to mass casualty events. Lieutenant Colonel Kim recognized the broader implications of Sarah's expertise. Ms. Chen, your methods could influence emergency medicine training beyond military applications. The Pentagon would probably support research into civilian applications as part of Homeland Security preparedness. The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant First Class Michael Rodriguez, the base's senior medical instructor, who entered with urgent news from recent deployment reports. Rodriguez had been one of Sarah's most enthusiastic supporters from the beginning, recognizing immediately that her expertise exceeded anything available through traditional military medical training. Ms. Chen, I just received feedback from the 173rd Airborne medics who completed your certification program before their recent deployment to Eastern Europe. Their performance in actual medical emergencies has been extraordinary. Sarah looked up with immediate interest. Deployment feedback represented the ultimate test of her training methods, providing data on how well her techniques prepared medics for actual combat medical situations. What specific feedback did they provide? 3 separate incidents where medics trained in your program saved lives that would likely have been lost using standard procedures. The unit commander specifically requested that all future medics receive your advanced certification before deployment. The deployment success stories validated Sarah's approach to combat medical training and demonstrated that her innovations produced measurable improvements in actual battlefield medical outcomes. Such feedback was crucial for convincing military leadership to expand her programs. Dr. Foster examined the deployment reports with professional excitement. Sarah, this represents concrete evidence that your training methods improve actual combat medical effectiveness. This kind of real-world validation is exactly what the Pentagon needs to justify expanding your programs. Sarah reviewed the specific incidents described in the deployment reports, noting how her students had applied techniques they'd learned in her simulation exercises to save lives in actual combat situations. The connection between training and results was clear and convincing. The key is preparing medics for decision-making under pressure, rather than just teaching technical procedures, Sarah explained. When students experience realistic stress during training, they perform better when they encounter actual combat situations. Lieutenant Colonel Kim understood the strategic implications of the deployment feedback. Ms. Chen, these results will strengthen the Pentagon's justification for expanding your program to special operations units. Proven effectiveness in actual combat situations is the strongest possible endorsement for training methods. The discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Patricia Hayes, who entered with news that would significantly expand Sarah's role at Fort McKenzie and beyond. Hayes carried a folder marked with Pentagon classification symbols, indicating that the information involved high-level military planning. Ms. Chen, I have official notification from the Department of Defense regarding your expanded role in military medical training, Hayes announced, settling into a chair with obvious satisfaction about the news she was delivering. Sarah looked up with curiosity about the Pentagon's latest decisions regarding her program. The rapid expansion of her influence had been gratifying but also somewhat overwhelming, requiring her to manage responsibilities that extended far beyond her original consulting contract. Colonel Hayes, what specific role does the Pentagon envision for the expanded program? Director of Advanced Combat Medicine Training for all service branches, with authority to develop curriculum standards and certification requirements for military medical personnel across the entire Department of Defense. The appointment represented recognition that Sarah's innovations had proven themselves sufficiently to warrant military-wide implementation. Her methods would now influence medical training for Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps medical personnel, potentially affecting thousands of military medics and the soldiers they would treat. Dr. Foster stared at Colonel Hayes with amazement. Sarah would be responsible for military medical training across all service branches? Correct. The Pentagon recognizes that her methods represent a significant advancement in military medical capability that should be implemented uniformly across all military medical training programs. Sarah considered the scope of responsibility that such an appointment would entail. Her influence would extend from basic military medical training through the most advanced special operations medical programs, affecting medical preparedness for deployed units worldwide. Colonel Hayes, what timeline does the Pentagon envision for implementing service-wide curriculum changes? 18 months for complete implementation across all basic military medical training programs, with advanced programs following within 24 months. The urgency reflects their assessment that delays in implementation could cost lives in future operations. Lieutenant Colonel Kim understood the historical significance of Sarah's appointment. Miss Chen, this would make you one of the most influential military medical training authorities in decades. Your methods would affect military medical readiness for years to come. The appointment also represented complete vindication for Sarah's qualifications and a comprehensive rejection of the bureaucratic gatekeeping that had initially excluded her from Fort McKenzie. Her expertise was now being recognized at the highest levels of military command. Captain Torres approached with additional feedback from recent training exercises. Ms. Chen, the students completing your advanced certification are requesting follow-up training opportunities. They want access to even more challenging simulation exercises. Sarah smiled at the enthusiasm her students showed for advanced training. Captain Torres, we can develop progressive certification levels that provide increasingly challenging scenarios for students who want to push their capabilities further. The request for more advanced training reflected the confidence that Sarah's methods instilled in students. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by the challenges of combat medicine, students who completed her program felt prepared and eager for additional learning opportunities. Dr. Foster was developing research proposals to study the long-term effects of Sarah's training methods on military medical outcomes. Sarah, I want to establish longitudinal studies that track the performance of medics trained in your program throughout their military careers. Long-term performance data would help us refine the training methods and identify areas where additional preparation might be beneficial, Sarah agreed. We should also study the psychological effects of stress inoculation training on military medical personnel. Sergeant Rodriguez had been quietly listening to the discussion of Sarah's expanded role, and his expression reflected both pride in her success and concern about losing access to her expertise at Fort McKenzie. Ms. Chen, will your new Pentagon role require you to relocate from Fort McKenzie? Sarah looked around the room at the people who'd supported her work and helped develop the programs that had gained national recognition. Fort McKenzie had become more than just a workplace. It had become a community that had recognized her expertise and given her the opportunity to prove its value. Sergeant Rodriguez, the Pentagon position will require significant travel, but I'd like to maintain Fort McKenzie as my primary base of operations. This is where the programs were developed, and this is where they should continue to evolve. Colonel Hayes nodded with satisfaction. Ms. Chen, Fort McKenzie would be honored to serve as the headquarters for your expanded program. We'll provide whatever resources you need to support your Pentagon responsibilities. The decision to remain at Fort McKenzie reflected Sarah's recognition that institutional support was crucial for program success. The base had provided the environment where her innovations could be tested and refined, and maintaining that connection would benefit future program development. Dr. Foster was already planning research collaborations that would support Sarah's expanded role. Sarah, we can establish Fort McKenzie as a research center for combat medicine training methodology. Our work could influence military medical training globally. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Major Kevin Matthews, Sarah's former student who'd recently returned from deployment with exceptional performance reports from his unit's medical officer. Matthews had been transformed from a skeptical participant into one of Sarah's most effective advocates for advanced combat medicine training. Ms. Chen, I wanted to report on how your training performed during actual deployment operations, Matthews announced, his expression reflecting both professional respect and personal gratitude for the preparation she'd provided. Sarah looked up with immediate interest in deployment feedback. Major Matthews, what specific situations did you encounter where the training proved beneficial? Multiple trauma scenarios where standard medical procedures would have been inadequate. The pressure point techniques you taught saved 3 lives during a vehicle ambush, and the psychological preparation helped me maintain focus during a mortar attack on our aid station. This specific examples Matthews provided demonstrated how Sarah's training translated directly into improved performance in actual combat medical situations. Such concrete evidence was crucial for validating her methods and supporting expansion of her programs. Dr. Foster was particularly interested in the psychological aspects of Matthews' deployment experience. Major Matthews, how did the stress inoculation training affect your performance under actual combat pressure? It was like experiencing déjà vu during actual emergencies. The pressure and chaos felt familiar because of the simulation exercises, so I could focus on medical procedures rather than being overwhelmed by the environment. Lieutenant Colonel Kim recognized the strategic value of Matthews' testimony. Major Matthews, Would you be willing to provide formal testimony to Pentagon evaluators about the effectiveness of Ms. Chen's training methods? Absolutely, sir. I'd recommend her training for every military medic before deployment. The preparation she provides could save lives throughout the military medical system. Sarah was gratified by Matthews's endorsement, but she was also thinking about how his feedback could be used to improve future training programs. Major Matthews, what additional preparation do you think would have been beneficial for your deployment? Matthews considered the question carefully before responding. Extended duration scenarios that replicate the fatigue and resource limitations of actual combat deployments. Your simulation exercises are intense, but they're relatively short compared to the sustained pressure of actual operations. The suggestion aligned with Sarah's own thinking about program improvements. Combat operations often involved sustained medical challenges that exceeded the duration of training exercises, and preparing medics for such endurance requirements would improve their effectiveness. We can develop extended simulation exercises that replicate multi-day combat medical operations, Sarah agreed. Students need experience managing fatigue and resource limitations over longer periods. Colonel Hayes had been listening to the discussion with obvious satisfaction about the program's success and its expanding influence. Ms. Chen, your appointment to the Pentagon position includes authority to establish regional training centers that would extend your program's reach. Sarah looked up with interest in the logistical possibilities of expanded program implementation. Regional training centers would allow more military medical personnel to receive advanced certification without requiring them to travel to Fort McKenzie. Exactly. The Pentagon envisions establishing centers that would provide your training methods to military medical personnel throughout their geographic regions, making advanced combat medicine training more accessible. Dr. Foster understood the research opportunities that regional training centers would provide. Sarah, multiple training centers would generate data that could help us understand how your methods perform across different student populations and training environments. The expansion possibilities were exciting, but also challenging in terms of maintaining quality control and consistency across multiple training locations. Sarah's methods required instructors who understood both the technical aspects of combat medicine and the psychological principles underlying stress inoculation training. The key challenge will be training instructors who can effectively implement the methods without losing the essential elements that make them successful, Sarah noted. Combat medicine instruction requires experience that can't be easily replicated through standard instructor training programs. Lieutenant Colonel Kim recognized the instructor training challenge. Ms. Chen, would you consider developing an instructor certification program that would prepare qualified personnel to teach your methods at regional centers? An instructor certification program would be essential for maintaining quality control as the program expands, Sarah agreed. Instructors would need both technical medical expertise and understanding of stress inoculation psychology. Sergeant Rodriguez had been considering the practical implications of program expansion. Ms. Chen, regional training centers would require standardized equipment and simulation technology. Would the Pentagon provide funding for establishing multiple training facilities? Colonel Hayes consulted her Pentagon documentation before responding. Ms. Chen's appointment includes authorization for whatever resources are necessary to implement service-wide program expansion. The Pentagon considers this a critical military readiness initiative. The level of Pentagon support reflected recognition that Sarah's innovations represented a significant advancement in military capability that justified substantial investment. Her methods had proven themselves sufficiently to warrant major resource allocation for implementation. Captain Torres was excited about the opportunities that program expansion would create for military medical personnel. Ms. Chen, regional training centers would make advanced combat medicine training accessible to military medics who couldn't otherwise receive such preparation. Sarah was thinking about the long-term implications of service-wide program implementation. The goal is improving military medical readiness across all units, which requires making advanced training accessible to as many military medical personnel as possible. Dr. Foster was already planning research studies that would evaluate the effectiveness of expanded program implementation. Sarah, we should establish metrics for measuring program effectiveness across different training centers and student populations. The discussion was interrupted by an urgent message from the Pentagon requesting Sarah's immediate input on military medical training policy that was being considered by senior Defense Department leadership. The message indicated that her expertise was being sought for decisions that would affect military medical readiness at the highest levels. Colonel Hayes read the Pentagon message with obvious pride in Sarah's recognition. Ms. Chen, the Pentagon is requesting your immediate consultation on military medical training policy for deployed units. Your influence is extending to the highest levels of military planning. Sarah looked at the message with recognition that her role was evolving beyond training program development into broader military medical policy. Colonel Hayes, I'm honored to contribute to military medical policy development, but I want to ensure that policy decisions are based on actual combat medical experience rather than theoretical considerations. That's exactly why the Pentagon is seeking your input. Your combat experience provides credibility that purely academic expertise cannot match. The transformation of Sarah's role from excluded consultant to Pentagon policy advisor represented a complete reversal of the bureaucratic dismissal she'd faced just months earlier. Her expertise was now being sought by the highest levels of military leadership for the most important decisions affecting military medical readiness. Lieutenant Colonel Kim understood the historical significance of Sarah's influence on military medical policy. Ms. Chen, your input on Pentagon policy decisions could affect military medical preparedness for decades. Your combat experience provides perspectives that senior leadership needs for informed decision-making. Sarah was thinking about the responsibility that such influence entailed, and the importance of ensuring that policy decisions reflected the realities of combat medical operations rather than bureaucratic convenience or theoretical preferences. Military medical policy should be based on what works in actual combat situations rather than what looks good in policy documents, Sarah replied. Combat medicine requires practical solutions that can be implemented under extreme pressure. Dr. Foster was excited about the research opportunities that Sarah's policy influence would create. Sarah, your position would allow you to advocate for evidence-based military medical policy that reflects actual research data rather than assumptions or traditions. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of General Robert Morrison, the regional commander who'd traveled to Fort McKenzie specifically to discuss Sarah's expanded role and its implications for military medical readiness throughout his command area. General Morrison's presence indicated the highest levels of military recognition for Sarah's expertise and the importance of her program expansion for military readiness. His visit represented acknowledgement that her innovations had strategic significance that extended beyond individual training programs. Ms. Chen, General Morrison began, I've reviewed the performance data from units that have received your training, and the results are extraordinary. Your methods are producing measurable improvements in military medical effectiveness that justify immediate service-wide implementation. Sarah stood to address the general with appropriate military courtesy, recognizing that his support would be crucial for successful program expansion. General Morrison, I'm committed to ensuring that military medical personnel receive the most effective training possible for the challenges they'll face in deployment. Your commitment is evident in the results your program produces. I'm here to ensure that you have whatever support is necessary to expand your training methods throughout my command area. The general's support represented institutional recognition that would facilitate program expansion and eliminate bureaucratic obstacles that might otherwise slow implementation. His endorsement would carry significant weight throughout the military medical community. Colonel Hayes briefed General Morrison on the Pentagon's plans for Sarah's expanded role. General Morrison, Ms. Chen has been appointed Director of Advanced Combat Medicine Training for all service branches, with authority to establish regional training centers and develop service-wide curriculum standards. General Morrison nodded with obvious satisfaction about the Pentagon's decision. Ms. Chen, your appointment represents recognition that your innovations are too valuable to be limited to a single facility. Military medical readiness throughout the Defense Department will benefit from your expertise. Sarah was gratified by the general's support, but also conscious of the enormous responsibility that service-wide program implementation would entail. General Morrison's successful program expansion will require maintaining quality control while making training accessible to military medical personnel throughout their geographic regions. What specific support do you need to ensure successful implementation? Sarah had been thinking about the logistical requirements for program expansion since the Pentagon first expressed interest in service-wide implementation. Qualified instructors, standardized equipment, and funding for establishing regional training facilities that can replicate the simulation technology we've developed here. General Morrison consulted with his staff before responding. Ms. Chen, my command will provide whatever resources are necessary to establish regional training centers throughout our area of responsibility. Your program's proven effectiveness justifies significant investment in implementation. Dr. Foster understood the research opportunities that General Morrison's support would create. General Morrison, regional implementation would provide data that could help us understand how Ms. Chen's methods perform across different military units and operational environments. Dr. Foster, I want comprehensive research data on program effectiveness that can be used to justify expansion to other command areas. Ms. Chen's innovations should be implemented throughout the entire Defense Department. The level of support that General Morrison was providing reflected recognition that Sarah's program represented a strategic advantage that should be leveraged throughout the military medical system. Her innovations had proven themselves sufficiently to warrant major institutional commitment. Lieutenant Colonel Kim was excited about the opportunities that General Morrison's support would create for Fort McKenzie's role in program expansion. General Morrison, would Fort McKenzie serve as the headquarters for regional program implementation? Fort McKenzie will be the center of excellence for advanced combat medicine training throughout my command area. Ms. Chen's program will be our standard for military medical preparation. Sarah was honored by the recognition but also conscious of the challenges that rapid expansion would present. General Morrison, maintaining program effectiveness while expanding to multiple training centers will require careful attention to instructor training and quality control. Ms. Chen, you'll have full authority to establish whatever standards are necessary to ensure program effectiveness. Quality control is more important than rapid expansion. The conversation was interrupted by urgent news from the Pentagon regarding Sarah's immediate consultation on military medical policy. The message indicated that senior Defense Department leadership needed her input on decisions that would affect military medical readiness for deployed units worldwide. General Morrison read the Pentagon message with obvious recognition of its significance. Ms. Chen, Pentagon consultation on military medical policy represents the highest level of recognition for your expertise. Your influence is extending to strategic military planning. Sarah understood that Pentagon policy consultation would require her to translate combat medical experience into recommendations that could be implemented across the entire Defense Department. General Morrison, I want to ensure that policy recommendations reflect actual combat medical realities rather than theoretical considerations. That's exactly why the Pentagon is seeking your input. Your combat experience provides credibility that academic expertise cannot match. The meeting concluded with General Morrison's commitment to supporting Sarah's expanded role in Fort McKenzie's development as a center of excellence for advanced combat medicine training. His endorsement would facilitate program expansion throughout his command area and provide a model for implementation elsewhere. As the general departed, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary transformation of her situation over the past 6 months. The consultant who'd been excluded from Fort McKenzie due to bureaucratic gatekeeping had become one of the most influential military medical training authorities in the country. The Purple Heart tattoo on her arm remained visible as a symbol of the combat experience that had initially been dismissed but ultimately proved invaluable for improving military medical readiness. Her expertise had finally received the recognition it deserved, creating opportunities to save lives through improved training. Dr. Foster approached with excitement about the research possibilities that General Morrison's support would create. Sarah, regional program implementation will generate data that could influence military medical training for decades. Your innovations are becoming the foundation for future military medical preparedness. Sarah was gratified by the recognition, but remained focused on the practical goal of improving military medical effectiveness. The important thing is ensuring that military medical personnel receive training that prepares them for the realities they'll face in deployment. Everything else is secondary to that objective. The woman who'd been banned from the military base had become its most valuable asset, proving that expertise couldn't be hidden forever, and that bureaucratic prejudice ultimately failed when confronted with demonstrable results. Her journey from exclusion to influence would serve as a model for recognizing and utilizing expertise regardless of how it was packaged or presented. Sarah Chen's legacy at Fort McKenzie and beyond would be measured not in recognition or appointments, but in the lives saved by military medical personnel who'd received training that prepared them for the realities of combat medicine. The Purple Heart tattoo that had revealed her background would remain a symbol of expertise earned through sacrifice and proven through results. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.